I was abandoned at 4. My parents showed up 28 years later to sue me for my grandpa's 2.7 M estate. They didn't know I was a forensic accountant. The Seattle King County Courthouse is this imposing structure of granite and glass, a monument to the endless drizzle that defines our city. But inside, everything felt polished and cold, the exact opposite of the messy, hot rage churning in my stomach. I pushed through the heavy doors, and the smell of old coffee and bleach hit me, the smell of institutional justice. My heels, black and practical, clicked against the marble floor, a sound that usually gave me confidence when I was here prosecuting fraud cases. Today, those clicks felt like a drumroll for the biggest, most personal battle of my life. And then I saw them. Sylvie Thorne and Victor Thorne. The two people who signed my birth certificate, the two people who were suing me for every penny my grandfather had left me. Sylvie was leaning into her lawyer, Cassian Hale, whispering something while smoothing the lapel of her ridiculously expensive cream-colored suit. The diamonds on her wrist, a bracelet Alistair had paid for years ago, flashed under the fluorescent lights. She'd clearly dressed for the jury. She thought she would have the grieving, devoted daughter. Victor, my father, stood a few feet away, attempting to look dignified, though his usual athletic slump had evolved into a soft middle-aged anxiety. He checked his watch with theatrical impatience, probably rehearsing the excuses he'd use if this case didn't magically wipe out his latest disastrous real estate debts. They hadn't spotted me yet, which gave me a crucial minute to breathe and set my face. I needed Elara Vance, the forensic accountant, not Elara the abandoned child. Look who finally decided to grace us. Sylvie Stage whispered, loud enough for half the rotunda to hear. Our darling daughter. Late as always. The sheer, audacious irony of her calling me late, when their entire relationship with me had been one long, uninterrupted absence, almost made me laugh. Almost. I adjusted the simple black blazer I wore, a stark contrast to Sylvie's theatrical ensemble, and walked straight past them, making sure my shoulder brushed Victor's briefcase. I sat at the defendant's table, arranging my notes, focusing on the neat columns of numbers and dates. Anything to avoid looking back at the toxic circus they'd brought with them. The tension in the room ratcheted up when the bailiff called out, "All rise." The Honorable Judge Miriam Sterling presiding. Judge Sterling swept in, her robe dark and authoritative. Her eyes, known around Seattle for missing nothing, landed on me. "Ms. Vance," she stated, a hint of surprise in her measured tone. "It's unusual to see you on the defense side of the bar." I stood, keeping my voice steady and professional. "Yes, Your Honor. Family matters bring us all to unexpected places." Behind me, I felt the shift. Sylvie made a sharp, choked noise. Victor's face went pale, draining of all color. They hadn't done their homework. They had hired Cassian Hale, the shark, expecting a young, naive niece easily intimidated into settling. They had no idea that their abandoned 4-year-old was now Elara Vance, senior forensic accountant, known for dismantling complex financial fraud cases for one of the top firms in the Pacific Northwest, and a frequent expert witness in this very courtroom. The power dynamic, which they had planned to exploit, had just flipped violently. Cassian Hale recovered first, his practiced smirk replaced by a tight, calculating expression as he assessed me not as a roadblock, but as a genuine threat. "Your Honor," he smoothly interjected, rising to challenge me. "The plaintiff questions Ms. Vance's competency to manage the substantial and complex assets of Justice Vance's estate." Sylvie nodded enthusiastically beside him, still completely missing the point. "Your Honor," I replied, folding my hands neatly on the table, the picture of measured control. "I'll be represented by Rise Kincaid, and for the record, I successfully prosecuted 3 major investment fraud schemes, involving assets 5 times this size, before this bench last quarter." Judge Sterling gave a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. She knew exactly what was happening. And for the first time since my grandfather died, I felt a surge of cold, clarifying confidence. They were so screwed. But to truly appreciate the exquisite nature of this revenge, you have to understand the beginning. I wasn't in that Seattle courtroom anymore. I was 4 months old, bundled up on a scorching summer day in Bellingham, Washington, Back in 1993. The air was thick and humid, clinging to skin and tempers. Sylvie and Victor were arguing, their voices sharp and low, over the trunk of their car. Eleanor, my grandmother, stood by the porch swing, holding me tight. "It's just until we get settled, Mom," Sylvie promised, checking her perfect reflection in the car's side mirror. "You know how hard it is to launch a new lifestyle brand. We need stability. Which means not having a baby underfoot." Eleanor's face was a mask of pain, her hands trembling slightly as she held me. "The baby needs you, Sylvie. Not stability provided by your father." But Sylvie just waved a dismissive hand. "She has you and Dad. What could be more stable than a federal judge and his wife?" Victor slammed the trunk shut. "We're burning daylight. Gotta go." Their goodbyes were hurried. Perfunctory touches and air kisses. They drove away, without a single backward glance, in a borrowed convertible, heading toward the promise of a life that didn't include the responsibility of a child. And those few months stretched into 2 decades of absence, punctuated only by obligatory, painfully awkward holiday visits that felt less like family gatherings and more like performance art. My grandparents, Alastair and Eleanor Vance, became my everything. Alastair, the stern federal judge, taught me about justice not through dusty textbooks, but through bedtime stories about real cases, moral dilemmas, hard choices, and the precise, beautiful balance of the law. Eleanor's kitchen was my sanctuary, smelling of cinnamon and unconditional love. Consistent, reliable, and always present. They never missed a single school play, piano recital, or debate team victory. They were always front and center, while the 2 reserved chairs marked Sylvie and Victor Thorne remained perpetually, agonizingly empty. When I was 16, Eleanor died suddenly from a massive heart attack. The funeral was small and dignified, just like her. Sylvie and Victor showed up 45 minutes late, making a loud, theatrical entrance that ruined the quiet reverence. Sylvie complained loudly in the receiving line about how she looked terrible in black. While I stood beside the casket, Alastair's hand a steady weight on my shoulder. "I'll make you proud, Grandma," I whispered to the polished wood, tears blurring the familiar lines of her face. That night, something shifted. I realized the profound difference between biological relationship and chosen family. My real parents had been the 2 people who chose to love me every single day. Yet, even then, a stupid, deep-seated ache made me lean into Sylvie's hug after the burial, hoping for a genuine connection. Alastair, watching from the doorway, saw the flicker of hope on my face. "I still wish they'd stay," I confessed to him later that night, ashamed of the weakness in my voice. His eyes were kind, but sharp with the wisdom of a jurist. "Love is a choice, Ilara. A conscious decision we make every day, regardless of blood." It was a choice Sylvie and Victor only made years later, when money was involved. A month before the court date, and 2 weeks after Alastair's quiet passing, a relentless Seattle rain hammered the study window of the Queen Anne house. The hollow silence since the funeral was deafening. I stood before Alastair's massive mahogany desk, fingers tracing the lid of a small, ornately carved wooden box I'd never seen before. "What were you hiding, Alastair?" I whispered, lifting the lid. Inside, tucked away like secrets, were a series of leather-bound ledgers, each labeled with a year spanning the last 2 decades. I recognized his meticulous, judicial handwriting instantly, the script of a man who believed every single detail mattered. I pulled out the most recent volume, and settled into his massive leather chair, breathing in the faint, familiar scent of pipe tobacco and old paper. The first entry on the first page of the 2024 ledger hit me with the force of a physical blow. January 12, 2024. Sylvie called requesting emergency funds for Victor's latest venture. Sent 2 to 500 as usual. Marks 264 consecutive monthly payments. My hands began to shake as I reached for the calculator Alastair always kept nearby. The calculation was simple, but I needed to see the brutal, objective number. 22 years, 2,500 every single month, 60,000. They took enough to buy a house, I muttered, pressing my palms against the cool wood to steady myself. I pulled out the earlier ledgers, each revealing the same sickening, methodical pattern, 2,500 transfers, always documented. Always justified by some manufactured crisis. Tucked between the pages, I found photographs: Sylvie on a cruise ship in the Caribbean, Victor posing at a high-end golf course in Palm Springs. Dates corresponding to the exact weeks Sylvie had claimed she couldn't afford the gas to drive up and visit her ailing father. As midnight approached, I moved to Alistair's desktop computer. The password was instantly obvious: Eleanor's birthday, the one date he never forgot. Among the folders was one labeled, ominously, Thorn Requests. Email after email unfolded before me, a transparent campaign of emotional manipulation and financial exploitation that made my teeth ache. Daddy, Victor needs new equipment for his big break with the new investors. It's now or never. Daddy, I miss you terribly, but I can't afford the trip right now. If you could just help, I promise this will be the last time. Interspersed with the blatant demands were more insidious, passive-aggressive barbs. Mom always said you loved Elara more than me. I guess she was right. Victor's requests were rarer but always for larger sums, for business ventures that predictably collapsed, leaving only excuses and mounting debt. The clarity was agonizing. They hadn't seen Alistair as a father, he was simply a deeply reliable, shamefully easy ATM. I closed the emails, needing air. But instead my eyes fell on a desk drawer, marked with my name in Alistair's firm, familiar script. Inside lay a single sealed envelope, the wax seal bearing the emblem of the federal court. My hands trembled as I broke the seal. My dearest Elara, the note began. If you are reading this, they have already begun their pursuit. Remember what I taught you. Justice is not always found within the four walls of a courtroom. Sometimes it is found in standing firmly for the simple, undeniable truth. You have always been the best of me. They know this, too, which is why they fear you. Enclosed was a single, old photo, a younger Alistair in his full judicial robes, resolute and determined, wearing the exact expression I recognized in the mirror when a complex fraud case was finally clicking into place. The tears came then. Not of sadness, but of cleansing, righteous anger. I wouldn't let them desecrate his legacy. Defending the will wasn't about the 2.7 million. It was about honoring the man who had chosen to be my father, when my own had not. I was ready to use every skill Alistair had taught me, and every forensic accounting skill I had earned, to ensure they didn't just lose the case, but that they were utterly, professionally, and publicly dismantled. The morning after finding Alistair's ledgers and his letter, I went into full forensic audit mode. I wasn't grieving anymore, I was building a case. The first thing I did was run Sylvie Thorne's name through every public records database I could access. What I found was a pattern so transparent it was almost insulting. Cassian Hale, their attorney, had represented her in two previous, highly aggressive inheritance disputes, one involving a distant cousin in Arizona, and another concerning an elderly aunt's trust in Florida. Same pattern. Same claims: the devoted daughter, niece, who had been inexplicably cut out by a manipulating relative. The woman was a professional estate predator. Then I turned my attention to Victor. A quick search of county records and gaming commission databases confirmed my worst suspicions. He wasn't just a failed real estate developer, he was deep in gambling debt, owing tens of thousands to people who definitely preferred strong arm tactics over polite collection notices. His need for a quick, massive influx of cash wasn't just about business, it was about survival. The narrative they were spinning, that Alistair, in his dotage, had been manipulated by the ungrateful granddaughter, was just a smokescreen for their utter desperation and systemic exploitation. I closed the case files and called Rise Kincaid, the corporate litigation attorney Alistair had recommended years ago. Rise had the reputation of a quiet killer. He never sought the spotlight, but he always won the complicated cases. We met at a discreet coffee shop near the Pike Place Market. Rise listened without interruption, stirring his black coffee, as I laid out the financial timeline, the 660,000 in monthly payments, the evidence of Sylvie's previous predatory suits, and the timeline of Victor's debt spikes corresponding perfectly with their increased demands on Alistair. They're underestimating you, Raz finally said, pushing the pile of documents back toward me. They see a niece, I see an opponent who understands the money trail better than their own counsel. They think I'll buckle, I said. a cold edge entering my voice. They think I want their approval more than I want justice for Alistair. They're wrong. Ruz gave me a tight smile. Then we don't just defend the will, Alara. We expose the pattern. I'll handle the procedure, you focus on the evidence that proves undue influence on their part. Over 2 decades. He passed me a business card. Call Thomas Evans. He clerked for your grandfather for 15 years. He can speak to Alistair's mental acuity better than any doctor, and he's fiercely loyal to the family name. That evening, Sylvie's sickly sweet voice landed on my answering machine. Josie. Darling. We desperately need your legal expertise on this little inheritance matter. Call me, please. I drafted a response email that was surgically clean, each word a professional boundary. Dear Sylvie, all communication regarding Justice Vance's estate must be directed through my counsel, Raz Kincaid. Alara Vance. Within minutes, my personal cell rang. But, we're family. Sylvie wailed, the saccharine tone dropping instantly into a hard, demanding whine. Family shows up for more than just money, mother. I replied, the word, mother, feeling like ash on my tongue. The conversation ended abruptly. An hour later, Victor sent a short, thinly veiled threat via text message, claiming concern for my emotional well-being and professional stability. I screenshot it immediately, adding it to the growing evidence binder. The cost of this fight was the final, definitive severing of any foolish hope I'd harbored for a real relationship with them. In its place, however, was a profound certainty that I was doing right by the 2 people who truly raised me. 2 days later, the Seattle Herald landed on my doorstep with a nauseating thud. There was Sylvie's face, occupying half of page 3, eyes shining with expertly manufactured tears. Heartbroken daughter fights to honor father's true legacy, screamed the headline. The article was a masterpiece of revisionist history, painting me as the cold, calculating career woman who had isolated her elderly grandfather and was twisting his true wishes. Alistair was like a second father to me, after my own past, Sylvie claimed, conveniently forgetting that her own father was Victor, who is currently alive and well, and suing me alongside her. The hypocrisy made me physically ill. My work phone buzzed. It was Thomas Evans, the former clerk. Victor Thorne was here, he said without preamble. Cornered me in the lobby. Asked if you'd been acting erratic, if I was concerned about your judgment lately. Very convenient timing, isn't it? I pressed my fingers hard against my eyelids. What did you tell him? That he seemed surprisingly uninformed about the 3 major fraud cases you closed last month. Thomas paused. Alara. They've gone after your professional ethics. The Attorney General's office received 2 anonymous calls yesterday questioning a small procedural error on a non-related brief. They were attacking my professional life to undermine my credibility in the probate case. Before I could respond, an email notification popped up. Raz Kincaid. Hale filed an emergency motion to challenge Alistair's competency and moved the hearing up 2 weeks. They're rushing it. They think we're unprepared. Instead of panic, I felt a sharp, cold focus. They think I'll crack under pressure. They don't know me. That night, I worked at Alistair's mahogany desk, spreading documents across the surface like a crime scene investigator. Sleep was irrelevant. I built a methodical timeline of their parental absence. I dug out a box containing 20 years of their holiday cards, each one identical, machine, printed, and generic Merry Christmas, kiddo, love, mom and dad. No reference to my achievements, my school, or anything remotely personal. They simply never knew me well enough to write anything specific. I cross-referenced this with Alistair's private journals. Linda called again about money. An entry from when I was 13 read. Nothing about Alara's placement in the state debate finals. When I mentioned her winning, she changed the subject to the new boat Victor wanted. In a dusty photo album, I found something that made my hands shake. Old video, stills from my college graduation, my law school ceremony, before I moved entirely into forensics. Even my high school valedictorian speech. In every single shot, there were 2 chairs in the front row, marked with neat, handwritten signs. Reserved for Sylvie and Victor Thorne. 2 empty chairs that Alistair had dutifully saved, year after year, knowing they wouldn't come. I ran my finger over the neat lettering on one of the signs. They never knew me at all. I whispered into the quiet study. The next morning, I stood by Alistair's grave at the Mount Auburn Cemetery. My weekly ritual, something Sylvie and Victor hadn't bothered with once since his death. I was arranging fresh, yellow roses when I heard the crunch of gravel. Sylvie. She wore a ludicrously large coat despite the mild weather, her face registering surprise before immediately snapping into practiced calculation. I didn't expect to find you here, she said, glancing at her watch as if Alistair's grave were an inconvenient appointment. I come every week, I stated, facing her directly. Alistair saw you clearly, I said quietly, feeling his presence beside me. So do I. Something in my calmness, in my lack of fear, made her mask drop.
You always had it easy?
His favorite. We struggled while you lived in this mansion, getting everything handed to you. I looked at her, truly seeing the bitter, desperate woman beneath the designer coat. I had grandparents because I had to, I said. You had a father you chose to ignore. The slap came fast, shocking and sharp, echoing among the gravestones. My cheek burned, but I didn't move. Her hand hung in the air, wide-eyed in shock at her own violence. That's the last time, I told her, my voice low and steady. You will never touch me again. I turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone by the grave of the father she only bothered to know when she needed cash. Back at the house, I found a thick folder waiting for me. Thomas Evans had arrived while I was out. Hale has a pattern, he explained, spreading documents detailing 3 prior cases, where Cassian Hale had used the exact same tactics last-minute competency challenges, sudden evidence of procedural errors, and aggressive media strategies. As Thomas was detailing his findings, the doorbell rang. It was Mrs. Rodriguez, Alistair and Eleanor's housekeeper for 20 years. She held a large manila envelope. I was with him every day, she said firmly. That man was sharp until the end. He talked about everything. I've written it all down, dates, conversations, who visited and who didn't. Use it however you need, Miss Alara. With her statement added to the pile, I felt a quiet, professional confidence settle in my bones. People were appearing from every corner of Alistair's life, offering support and undeniable evidence. Each one proved what true loyalty looked like. Late that night, I discovered a hidden personal journal behind Alistair's law books. October 25, 2024. An entry from the week before his death. Sylvie called about the will today. Not about my health, though she pretended otherwise. Asked probing questions about my estate planning. I turned to the final page. Appointed Elara executor. Knowing she alone has the integrity to handle this. The others will come for what they think they deserve. They will underestimate her, as they always have. Tucked inside the back was a sealed envelope, addressed to the probate judge, a final, clear statement of his sound mind and deliberate decisions. 2 days later, in the preliminary competency hearing, Rez presented this letter, along with medical records and witness statements. Cassian Hale's face tightened as Judge Sterling reviewed the evidence. The evidence suggests Justice Vance was acutely aware of his decisions and their implications. She finally declared, dismissing the motion. The will stands as written pending full probate proceedings. As we exited, I caught Sylvie's eye. For the first time, her smirk was gone, replaced by genuine, cold worry. She finally understood she wasn't facing a niece. She was facing a forensic accountant with a vendetta. What aspect of the evidence, financial, emotional, or professional, do you think will be the most damaging to Sylvie and Victor? The initial victory, Judge Sterling dismissing the competency challenge, gave me a brief, sharp taste of satisfaction, but I knew the war was far from over. Cassian Hale, the lawyer for Sylvie and Victor, wasn't going to fold easily. He was known for turning up the heat when the evidence failed him. I spent the next few days with Ruz, meticulously organizing the evidence binder. We categorized everything financial records, showing the $66 in exploitation, my detailed timeline of absence from every major event, Alistair's personal journals, and the housekeeper's testimony confirming his mental clarity. And, finally, Sylvie's contradictory statements and history of inheritance predation. Every piece fit together like a complex puzzle revealing their true predatory motivations. As a forensic accountant, I lived for this level of detail. As Alastair's heir, I was fueled by 2 decades of suppressed resentment. Rise was a machine. He'd secured sealed court records from Sylvie's 2 previous inheritance battles, the cousin's will in Florida, and the uncle's trust in Arizona. The pattern was horrifyingly consistent: last-minute challenges, claims of isolation, and aggressive media positioning, all handled by attorneys with ties to Hale. She has a blueprint for this, Rez noted, pushing a transcript across the table. She's an experienced con artist who targets her own family. He then revealed the biggest legal weapon we had. I spoke with Judge Sterling's former clerk. There's a Washington Supreme Court ruling, Peterson v. Thornhill, 2012. It establishes that repeated, similar inheritance challenges can constitute a pattern of exploitation that is actionable, not just defensive. We can pivot from simply defending the will to demonstrating a premeditated course of conduct. A quiet confidence settled over me. This was it. They had expected me to fight on their turf, the emotional, messy battlefield of family drama. I was dragging them onto my turf, the objective, unforgiving territory of financial forensics and legal precedent. They wouldn't see this coming. The day before the full probate hearing, the conference room glass reflected my image as I arranged the final folders. Each deposition transcript, each financial summary, was a nail in the coffin they'd been building for themselves for 22 years. Rise entered with a strong black coffee and a stack of legal briefs. Hale filed a massive motion to exclude our pattern evidence. The Florida and Arizona cases, he announced. He's claiming it's prejudicial, not probative. I nodded, unsurprised. Which judge is hearing the exclusion motion? Judge Peterson. Raz grimaced. Not ideal. He's overly cautious about character assassination evidence. I knew Judge Peterson well. I'd won before him, but only by focusing purely on irrefutable numbers. We already had contingency strategies drafted for this scenario. I turned to the window, looking out at the moody Seattle skyline. Somewhere across town, Sylvie was likely choosing which subdued designer dress would best convey distressed innocence, rehearsing her tears for tomorrow. The Seattle Herald lay open on our table, featuring her latest tearful interview, Mother Fights for Family Legacy. Their PR consultant was good. The article painted me as calculating and cold, the ungrateful heir who had manipulated the aging, retired federal judge. This isn't about headlines, I reminded myself, recalling Alastair's voice. The court sees evidence, not media narratives. My internal communications channel buzzed. A message from Thomas Evans, who'd been tracking Alastair's old investment accounts. Found something massive. Lunch meeting. At noon. Thomas arrived with a file overflowing with bank statements. I tracked every single transfer, from Alastair to Sylvie over 22 years, he said, spreading the documents. But here's the pattern: the amounts spiked, dramatically. Every time Victor had a massive professional failure. Poor 10 Zalozin following his final release from minor league development, the 20-year Zalozin after his first real estate scheme collapsed. Each failure followed by an immediate, larger demand on Alastair. He pointed to a highlighted section. They were strategically bleeding him dry. They only turned up the pressure on the will when Alastair started selling off minor assets. A sign he was cutting off the flow. After Thomas left, I sat alone. The financial pattern laid bare. The inheritance wasn't just about money. It was about Alastair's agency, his right to control the legacy of a brilliant life. My phone rang. Sylvie's number. I almost declined, but put it on speaker as Ruz walked back into the room. Josie. Darling. Her voice dripped with practiced maternal concern. This has gotten out of hand. We can work this out as a family. Family. The word sounded revolting coming from her. That's what court is for now. I replied, my voice clinical and flat. Her breathing hitched. You're being ridiculous. You know, we can split it. 60-40. Just end this. Rez raised an eyebrow at the insulting offer. I'll see you in court tomorrow, Sylvie. I ended the call. The next morning, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Cashin Hale approached the bench with his usual theatrical arrogance. Your Honor, he began, this case is about manipulation. Manipulation of an elderly man by a woman who positioned herself as his sole caretaker, while systematically isolating him from his daughter, his true blood relation. I watched Judge Sterling's face, searching for any sign of doubt. Hale was good, he played the emotional card perfectly. He then moved for an immediate psychological evaluation of me, claiming my pattern of control suggests deep-seated issues. The whispers in the room became a murmur. Then, everything began to unravel for them. Dr. Levinson, our expert in cognitive assessment, took the stand. Her credentials were impeccable. In your professional opinion, was Justice Vance mentally competent when he revised his will? Rez asked. Absolutely, she replied, without hesitation. His cognitive scores were exceptional for any age. We reviewed his case notes. Justice Vance's intellect remained razor-sharp until his final days. Hale's cross-examination was aggressive but messy. He tried to claim she didn't assess for undue influence, but Rise objected, and the objection was sustained. Hale had expected to bully an amateur. He found himself blocked by a polished expert. By midday, the financial analyst methodically outlined every single payment from Alastair to Sylvie, $2,500 monthly, for 22 years, totaling $660,000. The room went silent as the number was projected onto the screen. Sylvie leaned over to Hale, whispering urgently. Their narrative of the devoted daughter denied her birthright, crumbling against the cold reality of documented financial exploitation. The afternoon brought 3 witnesses from Sylvie's past: her former in-laws, and a distant relative she'd sued before. Each testimony painted the same devastating picture of systematic predation. They all spoke of the same Mao, showing up only when money was involved, followed by aggressive legal action. Victor shifted uncomfortably during the third witness, physically distancing himself from Sylvie with every damning answer. And how many times did Mrs. Thorne visit her elderly uncle during his final illness? Rez asked the witness. Once, the relative replied. The day after he revised his will. Judge Sterling's pen paused mid-note. When court adjourned, reporters swarmed Sylvie, but her tears seemed theatrical now, her claims hollow against the morning's evidence. As I packed my briefcase, Ruz murmured, "First round to us, but the final day will be brutal. Hale will go straight for character assassination." I nodded, aware of Sylvie watching me from across the rotunda, her expression calculating and cold. Tomorrow would bring their counter witnesses. The former colleagues claiming Alastair was slipping, the emotional appeals. But the truth was out. Driven by the numbers Alastair had meticulously recorded, and the legal precedent Rise had unearthed. I knew, with absolute certainty, that tomorrow I would win. What do you predict will be the most crucial moment of the final day, and why? The final day of the hearing arrived with the weight of 28 years of abandonment pressing down on the courtroom. The air was thick, heavy with expectation, and I could feel Sylvie and Victor's desperation radiating from their table. Cassian Hale, their lawyer, approached the bench, his voice pitched for maximum theatrical effect. Your Honor, he began. We have demonstrated reasonable doubt about the execution of this will. The defense has presented Justice Vance as a brilliant legal mind, but even brilliance can create blindness. We maintain that Alara Vance orchestrated a campaign to control her grandfather's final years, isolating him from his true blood relation. He turned, gesturing dramatically toward me. We move for an immediate psychological evaluation of Josephine Carter, Alara Vance, as her pattern of control suggests deep-seated issues requiring professional assessment before any distribution of assets. It was a bold, last-ditch attempt at character assassination, and for a fleeting moment, I felt a surge of cold dread. But Ruz Kincaid was ready. He called William Foster, Alastair's personal banker for 30 years, to the stand. Mr. Foster, with his neat bow tie and starched collar, looked exactly like the paragon of financial probity he was. Mr. Foster, Rez began. Did Sylvie Thorne ever attempt to access her father's accounts during his lifetime? Cassian Hale was on his feet instantly.
Objection!
Beyond the scope. Judge Sterling cut him off. I'll allow it. The witness may answer. Foster adjusted his glasses, his voice crisp. Yes, on 3 separate occasions. Most recently, 4 days before Mr. Carter's, Justice Vance's, passing, She presented a healthcare power of attorney document, which Justice Vance had never signed. The courtroom fell silent. A gasp escaped Sylvie. Victor stared fixedly at the floor. Attempted financial fraud against the ailing patriarch. The defense had utterly destroyed their own narrative. No further questions. Rez stated, and I knew the momentum was irreversibly ours. What began as my defense was now their professional prosecution. I took the stand, hyper, aware of every eye. Mems Vance. Rez asked gently, why are you defending your grandfather's will with such rigor? Is this simply about the money? I met his gaze steadily, then turned slightly to address the bench. This case has never been about money, Your Honor. It is about truth and choice. I proceeded to recount a lifetime of abandonment. Holidays spent staring out a window, empty chairs at every milestone. Birthdays marked by delayed, perfunctory phone calls. I asked permission to read from Alistair's personal journal. I held the leather, bound book, my voice steady, betraying none of the emotion within. October 12, 2018. Sylvie called today. I had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that my illness might inspire her to become a daughter at last. Instead, she asked only about my investment portfolio. I then held up the faded calendar Eleanor had kept, covered in red X marks tracking Sylvie's promised, but missed, visits. 2 years of broken promises, Your Honor. Rez then dropped the final, devastating piece of evidence. Alistair's video deposition. Recorded 6 months before his death. Cassian Hale objected immediately, his voice strained and desperate, but Judge Sterling overruled him. Alistair appeared on the courtroom screens, sitting in his study, his face aged but his eyes sharp, his voice clear and deliberate. I make this recording in sound mind and body. He began, addressing the camera, anticipating a challenge to my will. I leave my estate to my granddaughter, Elara, not out of confusion or manipulation, but with clarity of purpose. He leaned forward slightly, looking directly into the lens. Sylvie, if you are watching this, know that I loved you until my last breath, but you chose absence. Elara chose loyalty. The law recognizes both blood and choice, and so did I. Sylvie let out an audible, theatrical sob. Victor remained slumped defeated. The numbers were the final execution. 660,000 in red. Documented payments flashed on the screen, contrasted sharply with a calendar showing Elara's 500 days of consistent care versus Sylvie's 8 documented visits over the same period. Judge Sterling delivered her ruling without retiring to chambers, a clear signal of her opinion. This court finds the challenge to Justice Alistair Vance's will entirely without merit. The will is upheld in its entirety. She paused, removing her glasses. Furthermore, I find this lawsuit frivolous at best, and predatory at worst. Attorney fees will be paid by the plaintiffs. Sylvie shot to her feet, her composure completely shattered.
This is absurd. I'm his daughter. Order!
Judge Sterling snapped, her gavel crashing down. This court is adjourned. Reporters surged forward. Sylvie pushed through the crowd, reaching for my arm, her face a mask of collapsing vanity and raw fear. Josie, Elara, please, she pleaded, I'm your mother. I turned fully to face her, camera flashes illuminating the moment. Eleanor was my mother, I said quietly, the words firm and final. You gave birth. Sylvie collapsed into immediate, unrestrained tears, a performance playing out for the dozen cameras, but devoid of any actual power. Victor, meanwhile, simply walked away, not even glancing back at his wife. The power dynamic from our first hostile encounter had completely, beautifully inverted. Outside, the cool Seattle air felt like liberation. Deep breath. Rez said, smiling beside me. You did it. How do you want to celebrate? I considered this as we walked down the courthouse steps. I think I'll buy some new rose bushes for Alistair and Eleanor's graves today. The driver opened the car door with a nod. Weirda, Miss Vance. I slid into the back seat, catching a glimpse of the imposing granite courthouse shrinking in the window. Home, I said. Finally, just home. A year later. The morning light streamed through the unblocked windows of Alistair's study, which was now my office. The walls breathed, lined with law books that blended his collection with the volumes I'd added. The phone rang. Judge Vance. It was the administrative director of the Justice Vance Legacy Foundation, the scholarship fund I'd established with the 2.7 million inheritance. The committee just approved the first 5 recipients, all raised by grandparents. One girl from Portland, her essay mentioned feeling more authentic with her grandmother than she ever did with her mother. A wave of profound peace washed over me. That's exactly what we created this for, I said, my fingers tracing the polished oak of Alistair's old gavel, now prominently displayed on my desk. The inheritance they had coveted now funded college educations for children whose stories mirrored my own. Becoming a circuit court judge, in the very courthouse where my battle with Sylvie played out, had a symmetry Alistair couldn't have scripted. Judge Sterling placed the black robe over my shoulders in the chamber Alistair once used. Your grandfather stood exactly where you are, she'd whispered. But you've already gone further than he hoped. I slipped a small, worn photo of Eleanor and Alistair into the robe's inner pocket, where it rests against my heart during proceedings. Sylvie's letter arrived a few months ago. Expensive stationery, offering reconciliation. Now that I was someone important. A year ago, it would have triggered hope or pain. Today, I read it twice, assessing her words with the measured clarity I gave to any case. My response was brief: I wish you well, but our paths diverged long ago. No anger, no vindication, only clarity. 5 years from now, standing before the mirror in the Massachusetts Supreme Court chambers at 41, I adjust my robe and catch a glimpse of my reflection. For a moment, Sylvie's mocking face from that first courtroom flashes in memory. But it's distant thunder, no longer a storm. The bailiff's voice echoes through the chamber. I'll rise for Justice Vance. The weight of Alistair's legacy rests on my shoulders, with a quiet confidence that comes from knowing exactly who I am. Justice is the family we choose, and presence is how we prove it.